I'm happy to introduce Dr. Beth Cole, but before I do that, I'd like to say a few words about the exhibit that the library is opening today. As some of you know, this lecture helps to open the exhibit Florence Nightingale, Life and Legacy, of which I am a co-curator, as well as two of my colleagues, Russ Taylor here in the library and Glenda Christians from the College of Nursing. The exhibition highlights the life and legacy of Florence Nightingale in honor of the 100th anniversary of her death. Known as the Lady with a Lamp and the founder of modern nursing, Nightingale made many contributions to public health, statistics, and nursing education. The exhibit includes manuscripts and books written both by and about Nightingale from the Lee Library's special collections. And we are so pleased to join with the College of Nursing in sponsoring this exhibit this year, and we hope that you'll all take some time to visit it either today or at another time during the year when it's up. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Beth Vaughn Cole. After growing up mostly in Cincinnati, Ohio, Dr. Beth Cole received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Cincinnati and her Master of Science degree from Boston University with a focus on child psychiatric nursing. She then worked at the Children's Hospital of Boston at the Judge Baker Guidance Center and taught at the Boston University School of Nursing. She came west after that and took a threefold position as the psychiatric clinical nurse specialist for the pediatric unit at the University of Utah Hospital, worked with the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and taught in the graduate psychiatric nursing program at the University of Utah. After completing her PhD at Brigham Young University in Family Studies, Dr. Cole worked full-time in the College of Nursing at the University of Utah. While at the University of Utah, Dr. Cole held many administrative positions. At the same time, she continued teaching students in the graduate psychiatric nursing program. She was the director of the psychiatric nursing program for many years and was the chair for the acute and chronic care division as well. At one time, she was the director of the doctoral program. While at the University of Utah, Dr. Cole was the director of Caring Connections, a hope and comfort in grief program, for 10 years. This program offered support services for families and friends who had a loved one die, taught programs for mental health professionals, provided programs for the public, and conducted research. Dr. Cole is the author of many publications, including numerous articles and a co-authored book titled Dealing with Sudden and Unexpected Death, a Handbook for Survivors. Dr. Cole returned to BYU in 2007 to serve as the dean of our College of Nursing, where she enjoys working with faculty, staff, and students focusing on nursing and the healer's art. Dr. Cole is married to Dr. Boyd N. Cole, and they have 4 children and 1 grandchild. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beth Cole.
Let's get everybody a seat if we can. And if I just need to know in the back, can you hear me okay? Someone in the back row, would you raise your hand? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. It'd be a pity to be talking and not to be heard. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm so grateful that you would come out and to listen, to learn a little bit more about maybe Florence Nightingale. She was an elegant woman. Welcome to this House of Learning, sponsored by the Harold B. Lee Library. This is their House of Learning lecture, and my name is Beth Cole, as they mentioned. And I'd like to thank all the library staff that worked so very hard to make this exhibit possible. Especially I'd like to thank Betsy Hopkins and Russ Taylor. They were just wonderful and worked so hard on this. From the College of Nursing, I'd like to thank the whole Nightingale Committee, Jean Bigelow, our alumni, Sherry Paulson, representing our College of Nursing Community Volunteer Leadership Council, Karen Lundberg and Cheryl Corbett from the College of Nursing faculty, who contributed greatly to the Nightingale Project. And in particular, I'd like to thank Glenda Christians from the faculty who worked closely with Betsy and Russ. You will see the fruits of their excellent work in the exhibit upstairs. I'd also like to thank Roseanne Jarrett. You know, these things can't get done without the support of your staff, and Roseanne was just wonderful. I'd like to acknowledge the BYU Department of Statistics and their contribution to the exhibit and the role that statistics has in the history of nursing. I'd also like to thank Sherry Paulson and Janet Searstens. Janet's a graduate of our program, and they're greeting everyone in period costumes. Hope you got to see them. A deep debt of gratitude is due to David McGee for his careful gathering of the material in the Victorian collection. He recognized the value of these items. The collection is more than the Nightingale items. Last year they had the Robert Burns exhibit out here for the last year, and it came from the same collection. Preserving the past is a major goal for most libraries. Through the vision and capacity of the Harold B.D. Library staff, they purchased the materials from Mr. McGee in 1969. As mentioned earlier, this is the 100th year anniversary of Florence Nightingale's death. Whoops, pressed something already. Let's see, where do I go? There we go. As most of you know, it's the 100th year anniversary of Florence's death, which gives us a perfect opportunity to focus a bit of attention on her enormous contribution to establishing the profession of nursing, and it gives the profession an opportunity to highlight a bit of its history and contributions to society. I have organized my presentation in 5 parts, and I'll go quickly, honestly. The first is a brief history of the Nightingale family and Victorian England, Florence Nightingale's early years, 6 people who influenced Florence, the Crimea and Nightingale at the Barracks Hospital, and after the Crimean War. As a psychiatric nurse, I am fascinated by interpersonal dynamics, and I believe that you will find the people in Florence's life very interesting. Beyond my personal interest, Florence Nightingale was a remarkable woman. I hope you will get to know her a bit better through this lecture and value her extraordinary contribution to society. I'll leave some time at the end for questions from the audience. The information from this presentation was generally taken from 3 books. That show up very well. This is Barbara Dossey's Florence Nightingale, Mystic Visionary Healer, Mark Bostridge's Florence Nightingale, The Making of an Icon, and Gillian Gill's Nightingales, The Extraordinary Upbringing and Curious Life of Miss Florence Nightingale. Most of the pictures are taken from Dossey's book and will be noted in the written text available online at the College of Nursing. Florence Nightingale was born in Florence, Italy on May 12, 1820. She was obviously named after the city of her birth, as was her sister, who was Frances Parthenope, who was born a year earlier. Parth, or Pop, was born in Naples, Italy, and named for her mother Frances, and after the Greek name for Naples, Parthenope, where she was born. Parth and Florence Nightingale's parents were Frances, known as Fanny, and William Edward Shore. Both children were born in Italy, where the Nightingales were on an extended honeymoon while their home at Leahurst was being renovated. This is a little bit of Florence Nightingale's genealogy. I'll go through that a little bit. As was typical of the time and society, generally only male heirs would inherit property. Peter Nightingale, I don't know if you can see it up there, that's Peter Nightingale, as was his father was also a Peter. But this Peter Nightingale of Leah was the childless uncle of William Edward Shore. Peter was known as a bit eccentric, though very prosperous in his time. He left his estate, Leahurst, to his nephew, William Edward Shore. Whoops, get in the middle here. Who went by Wen. He was the son of his sister Anne, of Peter's sister Anne. Again, typical of the time, William Edward Shore changed his name when he inherited the Nightingale estate. At age 21, he changed his name to William Edward Nightingale and was known widely as Wen. On receiving the estate, there were express directions that if Wen had no male heirs, the estate would go to a male heir of Wen's sister, Mary Shore Smith. This is an important element in the character development of Florence, and I'll touch on it again. This is a picture of Wen in his elder years. Wen's father was also a William Shore, and he was a successful banker. They could trace their family back to the 15th century. Their family started the first banking business in the town of Sheffield, England, in 1774. Coming from a wealthy family, and because there was a strong commitment to education, Wen first attended college at Cambridge and then at Edinburgh. At the time when Wen went to Cambridge, he was allowed to attend school, but not to graduate because he did not belong to the Church of England. Wen loved learning and was known for his keen intellect and breadth of knowledge combined with deep curiosity for learning. Well educated and an excellent property and money manager, Wen was successful in his own right all of his life. Now this is the Smith family. Brother and sister Wen and Mary married into the Smith family. Wen married Fanny, Frances Smith, and Mary, called Aunt May by Florence in her many letters, married Sam Smith. So up here you got to get the middle here. This is Frances or Fanny and Wen, and then down here is Sam and Aunt May. I'll talk about them again. He married Frances Smith in June 1818. Wen was 24 and Fanny was about 30. Fanny was the sister of his friend Octavius Smith. Octavius and Wen were friends at Hingham Hall. Hingham Hall was a school where the headmaster was Unitarian. Wen went to Cambridge at the same time as Sam Smith, another brother of Fanny's, and there is a record of the Smith family visiting the Shores when Wen was 10 years old. The families knew each other for many years, laying a foundation for their future marriages. Let me introduce you to Fanny. Whoops, that's the father, WilliamSmith. Let's see. Fanny's coming up here. There's Fanny. Fanny and her family. She was one of 12 children born to Martha, known as Patty, and William Smith. 10 children lived to adulthood. Fanny's father was William Smith. I'll go back. And he was a member of Parliament. He was a well-known member of the Whig Party, and Patty and William entertained many of the important notables of the day. William Smith had an extensive library and outstanding art collection, which included pieces by Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Reynolds, and others. The Smiths were Unitarians, thus were also part of the Dissenters. That's a category in English society. Dissenters included anyone not a member of the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Fanny's father, William Smith, was a close colleague of William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and others who fostered the abolition of slavery. If you've seen the movie Amazing Grace recently, you know that the history of this legislation issue in England. While William Smith was not a member of Parliament, at the time the final vote was taken, he had actively worked for years to pass anti-slavery legislation. William Smith had two other main goals for serving in Parliament. They were the extension of religious liberty, for dissenters were often persecuted, and the reform of Parliament, which was thought to be very corrupt and overly influenced by the Crown. He lived to see many of these changes occur in his lifetime. The author Bostridge noted William Smith was liberal in his religious views and open to exploring many religions, a trait he passed on to his granddaughter Florence. Fanny Nightingale was known as a beauty, very poised and gracious. Wen and Fanny were known for their social parties that engaged many of the notables of their day. Fanny was well suited for her role in society as the wife of an influential businessman. She loved the social world and politics that she had learned in her own home. After the birth of their two children, Wen and Fanny moved into the remodeled Leahurst. Oh, we can't tell, but it's quite elegant. And in 1925, Wen's wealth allowed them to purchase another elegant home in Embley Park, which was in Hampshire, where they would be closer to the social and political activities associated with London. There are many notable people living nearby, along with several of Fanny's sisters, and I'll talk about them in a minute. Florence Nightingale's early years. There are surviving letters that Florence wrote at age 7. She kept a correspondence with many people over her lifetime, and much of her prolific letter writing remains today. It was not unusual for a letter to be written several times and sent to different people. Even letters written to others could be requested to be returned and then collected as part of the diary or a travelogue. Before she became famous, she wrote to many notable people. She wrote to a large number of family members and friends, even several times a week. So he means she was writing a lot. As she began her campaign for health reform, she wrote letters to family friends who also were political leaders or influential in society. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There were two other members of Fanny had two brothers who were also in Parliament, so quite influential. There were at least three major influences in Florence's early life: her education, her health and the health of others that she was interested in, and her religious education and strivings. When Florence was 7, they had a governess hired, but yet her most influential tutor was her father, Father Wynne. Florence was an excellent student. Wynne took over Parthon and Florence's education. They studied geography, history, language, and mathematics. She studied French, German, Italian, and Turkish history, and she was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, German, and Italian, just like us, right? No. She was particularly drawn to making lists and organizing information. She liked math and how it solved questions and problems. She enjoyed talking with her father about social issues, politics, and many ideas that stirred her thinking. Dawsey says Florence was his intellectual companion, and she spent long hours studying and preparing her lessons with her father. Most Nightingale historians note that Florence had many illnesses as a child. Large estates were drafty, and Nightingale was frequently ill. Also, a large estate required many people to manage the grounds, the house and all its activities. Fanny and Florence would visit the villagers and take them food and herbs to help them in their illnesses. There are several stories about Florence caring for her sick dolls as a young child. There are surviving letters of Florence as a young girl and her notes on the illnesses of her family members. She wrote about caring for an ill cousin. When she was 9, her cousin Bonham, called Bonnie, Carter, died. He was only 10, and it affected her greatly. Dawsey wrote that Nightingale grew up in a world that was deeply religious. The church and religion were an integral part of everyday life. Through letters and writings of Florence, there is a record of her serious approach to her religious studies as a young girl. She would often have included scriptures in her letters. One letter, when she was 10 years old, when she wrote to her mother in 1830, included a list of things she would do: pray regularly and visit the poor people and take care of those who were sick. Nightingale wrote about her call from God later in her life. When she was 16, she believed that she received a message, and the message was, quote, that a quest there is and an end is a single secret spoken, unquote. She tried desperately to get her parents to allow her to go to Kaiserwerth, Germany, where a hospital was experimenting with educating deaconesses or Protestant nurses. In England, there were two tracks to becoming a nurse. Catholic nuns had orders devoted to caring for the sick, and poor women, often with questionable reputations, were assigned by the courts or hired by families to care for the sick in their homes. Florence believed there was a better way to care for people who were sick. In 1850, on a trip to Egypt with family friends, the Bracebridges, Nightingale had another spiritual experience. Dawsey reports she recorded in her diary, "God called me in the morning and asked me, would I do good for him alone, without the reputation," meaning without self-interest. By that time, Nightingale had refused 2 marriage proposals and questioned the purpose of her life. Let me introduce you to 3 women who strongly influenced Florence Nightingale and 3 men, for they helped build the foundation of her great contribution to society. The women were her Aunt May, Harriet Martineau, Selena Bracebridge, and the men were Lord Sidney Herbert, Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, and Richard Throckmorton Milnes. There were many others who played important roles in Florence's life and the health reforms she instituted. I encourage you to read about them in many of the biographies. But here is, this is Aunt May. That's the only picture we could find of her. And this is her husband, Sam, which is Fanny's brother. She was Florence's advocate with Florence's mother. supporting Florence's intellectual interests. This was extremely important as Florence tried to separate herself from her family's belief that Florence's only role should be as a married woman. The strength of those beliefs was so singular and so etched in society that Florence's wonderful contributions need to be recognized against this backdrop. The next person is Harriet Martineau. Harriet Martineau was a friend of Nightingale's Aunt Julie, one of Fanny's sisters. Both Harriet and Aunt Julie were concerned about social reform and the women's suffragette movement. They were concerned about the living conditions of children and the elderly. Both women were single and concerned about the limited options for women who were widows or did not marry. Harriet Martineau was a noted journalist and writer. Almost 20 years older than Florence, Harriet's early work focused on injustices to workers. She wrote historical books, Society of America, and History of England during the 30 Years' Peace. Martineau wrote over 1,500 newspaper columns and is recognized as the first woman of sociology for her methodological and analytical comparisons of societies. I'll note her role in social reform with Florence a little later. Next is Selena Bracebridge. Selena and her husband Charles were close friends with the Nightingales. They had no children of their own, and Nightingale would travel with them on extended trips. Selena rescued Florence on several occasions from the contention within the Nightingale family due to Florence's refusals to marry and her desire to find a purpose in her life. Selena introduced her to Sidney Herbert. That's the first person, gentleman. Whoop, that's Palmerston. Where's Sidney? Well, did we lose him? But anyway, let me tell you about Sidney. In 1848, on a trip with the Bracebridges to Italy, Selena introduced Florence to Elizabeth and Sidney Herbert. Sidney Herbert's wife, Elizabeth, was another young woman that the Bracebridges had befriended. Herbert was a wealthy landowner in Wiltshire, England, who was committed to providing better living and welfare resources for his tenants and villagers. He entered Parliament at 22 and was a member of Parliament until he died in 1861. In 1841, he was Secretary of the Admiralty and then the Secretary of War, the first time in 1845 and 46, and then again in 54 and 55 at the time of the war in Crimea. He was a serious reformer, and he worked to reform the War Department and other governmental agencies. Over his lifetime, he had many important political positions, and he wrote the official invitation to Florence to go to Turkey and the Crimea as the superintendent of nurses. He supported Florence in her quest for health reform. Next is Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston was a neighbor of the Nightingales at Embley Park. He was prime minister from 1855 to 58, again, the Crimea War, and 1859 to 65. He was known as a great British statesman and had significant political positions from 1809 until 1865, a long career. One of his talents was his astute use of public opinion to influence government. He was a key supporter of Nightingale and her reformist ideas and her work for nursing. Now, Richard Monckton Milnes is kind of an interesting character, also known as Lord Houghton, courted Florence for 7 years before she refused his hand in marriage. He soon married another woman, but he and Nightingale remained friends for life. He supported her reform efforts and gave her advice after the Crimea. Oh, there's Sidney. Hi, Sidney. You need upstairs in the exhibit, you'll see some pictures of Florence and an owl, and owls are significant in her life. Don't have time to talk about everything. I realize that this has been a long time in setting the frame, but Nightingale was a rather complicated woman. It seemed a little bit unfair to just talk about her work in the Crimea without an understanding of what happened before that event. Lord Shaftesbury, also known as Lord Ashley, was a great reformer, advocating for child labor laws and 10-hour workdays and other important reforms. He advised Nightingale to read the British government's Blue Books. These Blue Books were the British government's parliamentary reports. They were like almanacs or compilations of statistics and information. They greatly influenced Nightingale and taught her how to organize information in significant and persuasive ways. Nightingale visited Kaiserwerth Hospital twice, once for 2 weeks in 1850 and then for 3 months in 1851. Here she learned that to ensure quality, there had to be organization and rules. She wrote over 100 pages of notes of her careful observations and activities. She wrote to others about the sacredness of her work there. Most Nightingale biographers note she developed some of her beliefs about administration and organization from these visits. Finally, in 1852, Nightingale was able to build a life separate from the social entanglements of her family. After watching his daughter care for his dying mother, Grandmother Shore, Florence's father gave her an annual allowance and helped her move into a place of her own. He went against his wife and Parth's wishes and gave Florence permission to develop her own life. A charitable institution for sick gentlewomen was being reorganized, and Lady Canning and Elizabeth Herbert recommended Florence for the position of superintendent. Dawsey notes, keeping with social protocol of the time, which dictated that a lady of Nightingale's class could perform only charitable or philanthropic work, Nightingale received no salary as superintendent. We'd all like that, right? No. However, she was able to hone her administrative and organizational skills there. Nightingale focused on the environment, along with the care of the women. She applied her budgetary and mathematical skills in her quarterly reports. After completing her contract of 1 year, she left Harley Street Hospital. She had faced drunken workmen, limited supplies and resources, poor daily dietary support, and a variety of problems with the nurses. To many of us historical novices, the origins of the Crimean War may not be clear. In the 1850s, England wanted to maintain naval control in the eastern Mediterranean to protect their trade routes with India. Both France and Russia claimed they would protect Christians in the Holy Land, France representing the Roman Catholics and Russia, the Greek Orthodox Church. A conflict between the Roman Catholic monks and the Orthodox monks in Jerusalem broke out, and several Orthodox monks were killed. The Russians held the Turkish government responsible and moved troops in position to attack. After the Russian naval fleet wiped out the Turkish fleet, the English and the French governments demanded that the Russians leave the area. They declined. It was March 1854 when Britain sent troops to Turkey. News of the appalling conditions of the military hospitals, the treatment of the English soldiers, and the poor organization of the army was exposed to the public through the first modern war correspondent, William Howard Russell. Within 2 days of the newspaper article, which stirred the British public, Nightingale was invited to lead a volunteer group to Scutari. Florence contacted Lord Palmerston, who was the Home Secretary at the time. She contacted Elizabeth Herbert, Selena Bracebridge, and her housekeeper, all to help her. Sidney Herbert invited Florence, quote, to go to Scutari and supervise a group of nurses on behalf of the government, unquote. Now it was October. Remember, the war started in March, and it was now October 1854 when Florence left for Scutari with Selena and Charles Bracebridge and the nurses she had selected to accompany her. Her Uncle Sam went along part way with her. She was 34 years old. There were many details about her work there which are well documented. I hope you'll get a chance to read them. This is the barracks hospital, and I don't know if you can see real well, but right back here is where the nurses' quarters were, and I'll talk about them in just a second. Nightingale took 14 lay nurses and 10 Catholic nuns. One of the nuns was Mother Mary Clare Moore, who remained a lifelong friend. On her way to Scutari, Nightingale picked up some supplies that proved invaluable for the care of the soldiers. Lord Herbert had given Nightingale authority over the nurses with her and those to come. However, when Florence and the others got to Scutari, there were many barriers for providing care. First, the chief medical officer was Dr. Hall. He was not informed of her coming and was not pleased to have a group of women on his hands. Over time, Florence made friends with several of the physicians and helped institute the use of chloroform for surgery. In the beginning, Florence waited until she was invited to help. While they waited, Florence and the others set up their quarters in the barracks hospital. The nurses' quarters were cramped, to say the least. Nightingale wrote, There were 1,715 Crimean casualties at the hospital and 650 at the general hospital nearby, and another 570 were coming. There were 1,859 wounded and 480 killed at Inkerman. The physicians soon invited, Inkerman I think is, I can't see on the map. But anyway, they were soon invited to come in and to help with the wounded. When Nightingale and her team arrived at the barracks hospital in Scutari, the conditions were described as deplorable. Bostridge called it calamity unparalleled. Almost immediately, Nightingale began taking notes on the conditions. The blankets were filthy. The hospital sat over cesspools and the sewer lines were blocked. Vermin ran rampant. The windows were kept closed against the cold, trapping the sewer gases inside. Ordering supplies was chaotic. There were no working laundry facilities and there was no one designated to facilitate the repairs. The food was deplorable. There were 13 pots for both cooking meat and cooking tea. Florence wrote, "We now have 4 miles of beds." Nightingale kept track of the soldiers, their wounds, illnesses, and deaths. By January 1855, there were 2,500 men in the barracks hospital, 1,122 men in the general hospital nearby, and 250 convalescents behind the hospital. Frostbite, dysentery, gangrene, typhus, typhoid, and Crimean fever were overwhelming the hospital. Then another group of 1,200 sick soldiers were to arrive. 2 additional hospitals were opened. Gills wrote, "With an expert understanding of disease and possessed with the financial resources to allow her to take various measures, in the first 4 months, Florence Nightingale was the first person to institute a rational system for receiving and housing the patients as they arrived. Appalled by the filthy, blood and waste-soaked conditions the men arrived in, she made it a priority that the men and their linen should be washed and kept clean. She bought huge quantities of shirts and sheets so that the linen could be changed. She campaigned entirely and again against great resistance to set up a laundry where the hospital linen could be boiled to destroy the lice. She spent hours with her most skillful nurses washing wounds and changing dressings. She instructed her nurses to take a clean piece of rag for each patient, not use the same sponge for all the men, as had been the practice before. She bought mops, buckets, scrubbing brushes, and soap, and induced orderlies to clean the wards. She instituted an effective extra diet kitchen to provide the sickest men with thin cereal, chicken and beef broth, savory jellies, and lemonade. Reform was needed desperately, and Nightingale pushed forward. She would meet with any military or civilian official who would help her improve the conditions for the men. She wrote letters to Herbert and pressed for reform in 3 areas: food, hospital furniture and clothing, and permission to organize a daily routine. She wrote to Lord Shaftesbury and Lord Palmerston for a sanitary commission to come to Crimea. Dr. Sutherland, an authority in sanitation, headed this commission and was instrumental in removing the putrid matter and repaired the sewers. Overcoming resistance from many sources, Nightingale worked indefatigably. Isn't that an interesting word? It means you keep going, work hard. To improve the wretched conditions of the men. It was described that she would work 20 hours a day. She and her nurses would care for the wounded and help them write letters to the families back home. For many of the dying men, she wrote letters to their families talking about them, giving great comfort to the families. Nightingale was the only nurse allowed to go into the wards in the evening, which she often did. She was known for comforting the men and offering words of encouragement, even if she did not talk to them personally. Watching her minister to the needs of their colleagues endeared her to the men she had worked to serve. At night, as she walked the rows of wounded, ill, and dying, carrying the Turkish lamp that you'll see upstairs in the exhibition, accounts of her ministering to the sick and wounded were reported by the soldiers on their return to England. Nightingale's reputation as the lady with the lamp was immortalized by Longfellow in his poem, Santa Filomena. In May 1855, Nightingale became extremely ill and was diagnosed with Crimean fever. She was critically ill for 2 weeks and was weak and unable to care for herself for several more weeks. She was pale and emaciated. During her recovery, Lord Herbert gave her a terrier, and the troops gave her an owl to replace her beloved pet owl, Athena. Please note the owls in the exhibit, I mentioned that. She returned to the barracks hospital in July, and Florence suffered from residual effects of this Crimean illness, fever, for the rest of her life. The war ended in March 1856. Nightingale wrote that she would stay until the last soldier left the hospital. She returned to England quietly in July 1856. She saw her achievements in the Crimea only as the beginning or starting point for her future work. After the war, just as the squalid conditions of the army were fodder for the British newspapers, Florence's compassionate care of the soldiers was equally newsworthy. She received recognition from Queen Victoria and others. Money was donated to the Nightingale Fund to open the first secular nursing school based on Nightingale principles, even among controversy. After returning home by the back route, so she would not draw attention, Nightingale needed time to recover from her Crimean experience. She was weak and frail, plagued by nightmares and poor health. She refused most social engagements. Her chronic illness continued to compromise her health. Anyone who wanted to meet with her had to meet her at her residence. Her Aunt May stayed with her until 1859. She took care of her, helped organize her visitors, would transfer letters and papers to the people with whom she wanted to communicate. Deeply affected by her experiences and the many deaths she observed, Nightingale dedicated the rest of her life to reform of the Army's medical department. She wrote papers based on the data and evidence she had acquired from Scutari. She remained in close contact with Lord Herbert and Lord Palmerston and many other contacts in British politics. She contacted Harriet Martineau, the newspaper woman, to get her story out about the poor sanitary and health conditions. Probably because of her careful data gathering and many reports about conditions in Crimea, and her contribution to the Royal Commission report on the sanitary conditions of the Army, Nightingale was inducted into the London Statistical Society in 1860. She was known for this. This is called a Coxcomb diagram. You can't read it well, but it's a way of explaining data, and she did an excellent job. Lord Herbert died in 1861 and Lord Palmerston died in 1865, and Nightingale believed that her ability to influence additional reforms would stop with their deaths. But she continued to seek reforms for British military hospitals and community hospitals. Let me just say a few words about Florence and her work in India. Even though she rarely left her quarters after moving into South Street House in London, she gathered and wrote careful papers on British military hospitals and health care. Her relationship with Dr. Sutherland, who was the sanitary commissioner in the Crimea, continued until his death. He assisted her with much of her work on hospital reform and military health care reforms in India. He was quite deaf by the time he was working with her, and she was upstairs and she would write letters. So they have lots of letters between the two of them about the reforms that were going on, that they were trying to institute. Other friends that became lifelong friends are Benjamin Jowett. He's instrumental in her life. He was an Oxford professor and one-time vice chancellor. He corresponded with Florence for 33 years and frequently visited her. From the 1600s to the 1900s, India and Britain were closely linked. In 1857, relationships took a negative turn with an uprising near Delhi. A brief skirmish turned into a massacre of Europeans in Delhi and across northern India. The British Army responded with a vengeance. Although British troops regained order, relationships with the native people of India deteriorated, prompting additional British troops to be deployed. The increase in troops and Florence's investment and continued interest in Army medical reform consumed much of her time between the 1860s and the 1880s. Much of her work included gathering data from local Indian towns and healthcare facilities about illnesses, deaths, along with sanitation concerns. Before we close, I'd like to talk about two other areas of Nightingale's contributions. Her contribution to nursing education and her contribution to the women's movement of the 1880s. The Nightingale Fund that was started with Florence was in Scutari. while she was in Scutari, evolved into St. Thomas's Hospital and the Nightingale School of Nursing. The School of Nursing opened in July 1860. Due to pressures to complete her many reports in behalf of the military medical reform, Florence was not involved in the oversight of this nursing program until 1870. She was very involved in nursing reform through advocating for nurses in military settings and pushing her hospital, workhouse, and nursing reforms. Several of the letters in the Harold B. Lee Library exhibit upstairs are between Florence and Dr. Joseph Bell. Hope you get a chance to see them. He was a surgeon and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and organized the first training program for nurses in Scotland. As mentioned before, single women, whether widowed or never married, had few options in Victorian England. They did not have access to college education, could not own property, and with minimal education they could be governesses. Roles such as laundress and seamstress barely kept women and their families from the workhouse, if that. Unless families could afford to care for their single women relatives, they were ill-treated and suffered great poverty. In 1866, the first petition for the Women's Suffragette Committee was presented to Westminster Hall. English women received the vote in 1918. Thus it was 50 years of advocating. Florence's cousin, Barbara Leigh Bodichon, and other women that helped Florence advocate for sanitation and nursing reform were involved in advocating for women's rights. While Florence supported their efforts, she was not actively involved. She believed that she needed to continue her efforts in behalf of the soldiers of Scutari. However, due to her efforts to reform and advance nursing as a noble profession, she dramatically changed society's perception of the usefulness of women and employment opportunities for women. I've tried to summarize Nightingale's contribution to society, but it seems like an endless list. She transformed nursing from menial work to a role for women of good reputation who could contribute to society. She used her strong faith, Christian belief, and intellectual understanding to transform nursing, sanitation, hospital administration, hospital organization by educating herself and others. She used her intellect to carefully analyze and interpret relevant data and knowledge. Nightingale communicated her understanding and knowledge in papers and books. She influenced politics and public opinion. She used every means she had to improve the health and care of her soldiers. And generations later, we recognize the contributions of this woman to the foundation of nursing and statistics. A century after her death, we are still inspired by her life story. Florence Nightingale was a great woman. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.